Panicked culture, or how much catastrophe does a person need? Let us begin with a succinct thesis. Today's alternatives are already the children of catastrophe. What differentiates them from earlier generations and makes them the most likely candidates for a panicked culture is that their expert-like approach to the potential disasters that surround them. From a historical perspective, the alternatives are likely the first humans to cultivate a non-hysterical relationship to a possible apocalypse. For the first time ever, we do not have to imagine doomsday scenarios to see the writing on the wall. The current situation takes care of itself sufficiently. Nowadays, the apocalypse calls attention to itself as if its name were in Lights on Broadway. With dry professionalism, it writes its own letter of announcement. Apocalyptic alarm no longer presupposes religious uproar. Warnings of the end times do not imply that prophetic individuals have declared themselves to be the mouthpiece of transcendent revelations. The current alternative consciousness is characterized by what we might call a pragmatic attitude towards catastrophe. The catastrophic is now a category that no longer belongs to visions, but to perception. Nowadays, anyone can be a prophet if they dare to say anything at all. In any case, catastrophe needs less an announcement than a transcript. Linguistically, its place is not among apocalyptic promises, but among the daily news and committee reports. The writing on the wall appears in ordinary language, and the only thing that belongs to modern doomsday prophecies, aside from a spray can, is empirical data, such as that pertaining to the events of the year 1986, which was already attained symbolic features with its series of fatal accidents. What can the expression panicked culture mean? Does panicked experience even allow for culture? To the extent that culture must be built upon expectations, repetitions, certainties and institutions, does it not presume the lack, indeed the exclusion, of the element of panic? We vote for the opposite to be the case. It is only through proximity to panicked experiences that living cultures are possible. It is only the occasional experience of the extreme that exposes the temperate human region where we can cultivate what we are competent to do. One of the attributes of the Greek Pan was to be the god of the midday hour when the shadows are at their shortest, and the world is dashed to the ground by light, holding its breath in his presence. The modern term panic forgets this connection between presence, revelation, and fright. The only thing it remembers is the kinetic motif of directionless escape. Above all, it no longer knows what is most important. Bearable human life is always an island within the unbearable, and the existence of islanders is only ensured through the discretion of a subtly present ocean. The world that we are assured of is thus always placed against an either Judeo-Christian apocalyptic or pagan panicked background. But modernity wants presence without tears. It sees culture only as a state of being where the existence of faucets answers the question about the origin of water, just as the problem of the origin of truth is taken care of through the dealings of scholars. A panicked culture would be immediately recognised by its respect for faucets. After all, it is possible that when you turn one on, the ocean comes out. It would be no different with the sciences, especially since they have been generating things for a long time now, under which the world has the same right to cower as humans and animals once did under the panicked Greek light of midday. A few questions are now inevitable. Does alternative culture then need catastrophe? Does it secretly approve of disasters, as people sometimes fear to be the case? Does it have to be addicted to calamity because only this creates a climate where alternative ideas gain popularity? Is catastrophe essential for the introduction of a new movement, like a teacher who eventually convinces even the most stubborn minds of his or her lessons? Do humans need catastrophe because they must be educated, and can only be educated by the school of worst possible scenarios? Consequently, are the real hopes of alternative movements not linked to disaster didactic calculations, provided it is true that only a visual instruction of the worst can usher in a turn for the better? It was in the days of the Harrisburg nuclear accident on 3 Mile Island in 1979 that I really understood what disaster didactics meant for the first time. As the out-of-control reactor boiled and everyone held their breath to see if this infernal machine would explode, I noticed an uncanny phenomenon in myself and in others. Of course, no one could have any doubt about the devastation that an explosion of the nuclear reactor could cause, nor could anyone guarantee that what seemed to be a safe distance from accidents of this kind was actually safe. And yet at the time of Harrisburg, there was an option in the air in favour of the catastrophe. One could sense a sly sympathy with the explosive substances in the reactor casing. It was as if the deadly radioactive substances not only represented a physical quantity, but also contained a culturally critical message that deserved to be released. The small, immoralist neurosis in the face of the defective nuclear reactor was therefore not just a milieu-specific perversity, not just a sign of pyromania, or evidence of an inclination towards the macabre within the human nervous system that is characterized by ever stronger stimuli to gain arousal. In it, a whole way of thinking came to light together with its dubiousness, within its logic. The option for the explosion was nothing more than an educational hypothesis about the didactic and mind-changing energies that radiate from actually occurring disasters. Only through Chernobyl did the underlying disaster pedagogical implications of Harrisburg come to light. Indeed, if the worst has to occur before relearning can begin, then, from this perspective, the Harrisburg incident was not bad enough. Because the big explosion failed to materialise, the Harrisburg disaster could not reach the level where disaster didactics develops its grim calculations. It is the level where one believes that compelling connections between misfortune and insight can be formed. According to this dicey logic, such connections arise through an absurdly magnified application of the basic idea that those who do not listen will have to learn the hard way. In fact, disaster pedagogical thinking promises that even the greatest calamity can be referred to a human scale. That is, into the field of sensible measures for preventing its repetition, through subsequent learning. Consequently, after Harrisburg, the term warning disaster made a career for itself in the vocabulary of alternative movements, a term that encapsulates the hope that disasters might penetrate our otherwise unteachable minds like probes and ignite new insights within them. This desperate theory of learning shines a light on the state of the enterprise that had been calling itself Enlightenment since the 18th century. It began as a utopia of an unforced guidance towards better understanding. By using the soft logic of an autonomous thinking that listens to the voice of reason, it wanted to eliminate the violence that cuts deep when it comes to learning the hard way. In the meantime, however, even the well-meaning old enlighteners are not very far from adding disaster to the curriculum of humanity as the last pedagogical tool, if it is really the only way that something can still be learned. Thus, we can see how classical enlightenment, with its concept of truth based on argumentation, has been pitifully put on the defensive. No one seriously believes that something essential can still be reached on the path of listening. Quote, "Let learning the hard way be welcome, for listening has failed." End quote. There are more than a few tireless members of the old Enlightenment troop who are already at the point of being glad if at least one treatment of learning the hard way in the face of disasters that cut deep could contribute a little bit to the establishment of truth in the civilizing process at the very last moment. Ugh, this word that burns the tongue. And thus emerges the strange affective pull towards actually occurring doom. The catastrophe will show them. The real present calamity apparently closes the gap between argument and disclosure, bridging the distance between the appeal to the imaginative consciousness and its overpowering with existing evidence. The catastrophe is thus the apt reversal of a miracle. No wonder. And why is it not one? Because it is a direct consequence of what the deluded activists are up to. The real present catastrophe thus attains a formidable truth-theoretical function. It complements the mere argument and brings massively into presence what can otherwise only be learned. By bridging the evidence gap between listening and learning the hard way, the didactic catastrophe places the epiphanic truth of an event above the discursive truth of the imagination. And thus the problem of learning from disasters leads to the logical centre of enlightenment and modernity. Modernity is, after all, the enterprise where human intelligence is not content with just giving voice to right pronouncements about the world. It can only be satisfied if it has actively ensured that the right things happen to the world as a whole. But this active concern for what is right is in the most radical crisis. For if now even human-made catastrophe ought to impose a tax on learning how to do things right, then it is a fatal testament to the way that modernity has strayed from its conception of learnable right action under the guidance of success and truth. The hope for a way to learn from the worst thing at the very last minute is difficult to distinguish from despair about the possibility of learning at all. Four brief comments will illustrate the risks and limitations of disaster didactic thinking below. It is only from the failure of this desperate learning theory that the reason why alternative cultures will only be possible as a panicked culture becomes plausible. These observations are commentary on the question that is on the lips of every contemporary. What more needs to happen before something happens? Practically oriented, it could also say, how big would a catastrophe need to get before it radiates the universal flash of insight that we are waiting for? From what point on would disasters be the self-evident grounds for radical mentality-changing insights? How bad does it have to get before it can get any better? Does it have to get bad at all? Does the underlying link between misfortune and insight have validity? It is clear from the very first remark how problematic an answer to those questions would be. Indeed, how problematic the questions themselves are already. Clearly there is no quantitative measure that could be adopted as the didactically sufficient size of the disaster. In various ways, the conscious minds of humans have the ability to stay immune to disastrous evidence. Presumably, the silent majority always stays outside the possible radius of damage of great disasters. Additionally, the citizens of the modern epoch have long experienced their era as a fateful event that cannot be mapped onto any reasonable will. The second fatalism that is dawning on all sides belongs to an awareness that realises the extent to which things already occurred differently than one might think. Moreover, the most powerful groups of modern societies have politically, ideologically, entrepreneurially and vitally invested so much in the most dangerous mobilisation techniques that even accidents on the largest scale must not cause any doubts on grounds of principles about the course and speed of the civilising process. In these circles, mentalities exist that are irreversibly, extremely set on mobilisation. In the bunker of their automatic responses, they can hold their own against any agitation. Even evidence of actual disaster ricochets off such structures. For them, revelation does not take place. In the end, minds are tougher than facts. And those who did not want to listen when it was still possible will also make themselves immune to learning the hard way too. If these considerations are true, then the insinuation that Harrisburg was not yet bad enough to learn anything decisive from becomes doubly transparent in its questionability. Obviously, catastrophe is conceived here as a quantum which, according to allopathic principles, produces stronger effects at higher dosages. With this logic, we immediately get into the most uncomfortable escalation. The victims of Chernobyl will have been lying in terrible agonies for a long time, when a zealous didactics announces itself and says, "Chernobyl was not terrible enough either, because after all, the international organisation of soldiering on is holding it together more determinedly than ever." The relentless consequence of this can only be that more has to happen. But to what extent? The pedagogization of disaster eventually also fails because of an aesthetic subversion. Since metaphysical or moral meanings for major accidents are no longer available to us in the modern age, images of disaster can no longer be easily provided with a moral key. To the extent that the readability of catastrophes ends, their phenomenal and aesthetic visibility is revealed. On the day after the Challenger disaster in 1986, I was giving a lecture on the criteria of postmodern aesthetics at the Academy of Art in Karlsruhe, which was followed by a discussion with the audience. There, a not-so-young student in a black shirt and grey hat spoke up and declared almost triumphantly that he had enjoyed the televised images of the exploding rocket. Hearing that confession, I stood there for a moment speechless. You are suddenly in the eye of the storm, knowing that this was said from within the core of modern kinesthetics, where the world is spun into a series of images. And with such memories, you remain sceptical towards the prospect of epiphany through disaster evidence. In the best-case scenario, a demonic Kantianism would emerge, which would transfer the concept of the sublime from the critique of judgment to reactor explosions and the view of biologically dead oceans. And the second remark on disaster didactics connects to the topos of learning through mistakes, wherein humanity's oldest theory of learning is stored. It contains the insight that only a child who has had a burn can understand fire. Because intelligence is not a theoretical quantity, but represents a behavioural quality of creatures in an open environment, it must go through the school of fire. Without experiencing burns, you have no idea how to cope with life. The world is not always good and does not tolerate all kinds of behaviour. A warning pane must be engraved in the nervous system in order to reliably embody the selectivity predetermined by the world. Human wisdom has been bound to the engrams of suffering from time immemorial. Thereby, disaster didactic thinking seems initially justified, because it is based on the assumption that humanity makes sense of nuclear damage in an epoch-spanning learning process. This sense-making would be identical to the act we are facing in the drama of the history of species, because humanity enters its path into the unprecedented as a student without a teacher. It would have to teach itself what it cannot learn from anyone else. It must endure being fated to an autodidactics as a matter of life and death. Its goal of study sounds like a fairy tale. It is supposed to transform itself through its own power from a coercive community of deadly stupidity into an ecumenism of intelligences. Evidently outrageous demands that are being made of its autodidactic genius. In a study of itself that involves many victims, we will see if humanity can teach itself about itself and its planetary situation, or if it still proves to be a learning-impaired subject. The question of the learning ability of our species touches on a critical point. Humanity is a priori learning impaired because it is not a subject, but an aggregate. When we speak of humanity, we are creating a general term that can only haunt speculative sentences in the form of an allegorical subject, sentences that the Age of Enlightenment made carefree use of. What appears to be a crisis of Enlightenment universalism today is in fact a transition from the study of humanistic allegories of the species to that of a hard ecology of local intelligences. This ecology begins only after the completed insight that humanity has no self, no intellectual coherence, no reliable organ of wakefulness, no self-reflection capable of learning, no identity-building common memory. That is why humanity cannot be wiser than a single human being. Indeed, even as a whole, it cannot become as wise as an individual who has learned the hard way. The aggregate we call humanity has no body of its own with which to learn the hard way, no hand by which to learn firsthand, but rather a foreign body, its place of residence, the earth, which does not become wise but transforms into a desert. The classical model of learning from harm collapses before this fact. All future learning processes at the level of the species will be fraught with an almost intractable problem of transmission. The question of how acquired and embodied intelligence can be transferred from one who has become wise to the unwise. More generally speaking, how individual insights can be incorporated into social institutions and technical systems. Only individuals can be wise. Institutions are well designed at best. The third remark concerns itself not with the subjectlessness of humanity, but the subjectlessness of disaster, if I may use that manner of speaking. Our everyday understanding shows an inkling of this when it follows its usual habit of interpreting great disasters in a fatalistic way. We think of fatality under the schema of the anonymous event. In contrast, it is crucial for disaster didactics to view even the most massive disaster under the schema of personal action. Disaster as event does not have the same grammar as disaster as action. Of the first we say, it happened, it fell upon us. Of the second, someone did it. Someone let it get to this point. It is only when the disaster has a subject, you could also say a culprit, that it makes sense to interpret it as a stimulus for self-critical relearning. In order for learning to become possible after disasters, a subject must be assumed that sees the disaster as their own and refers to it as their own deed. Only disasters that are committed by someone can form this arc of reflection which confronts the perpetrator with themselves while bypassing the event. It is only disaster as action that creates this recourse, which presents the seemingly impersonal calamity to a particular subject as their previously hidden true reality. Understanding the disaster, therefore, means setting in motion a kind of Oedipal investigation. Only insofar as the disaster that happened is an indirect crime does the investigation expect metanoia, rethinking, and repentance from an unconscious or hybrid perpetrator. Thus, here, as in any thinking that judges morally, both the interpretation of the event as deed and the identifying of a culprit are indispensable. It remains questionable, however, if an accident like that of Chernobyl can be attributed to an offender. Aside from the operational aspects and the general breakdown risks, isn't Chernobyl also a result of epistemological and socio-cultural developments in an anonymous and unattributable way, which build upon premises that are thousands of years old and lead to nuclear technology? Is it still possible to seek culprits and assign responsibility in processes of this scale? It would be justified if it could be shown that this entire development is an occurrence where the occidental type of human theoretically works out their unmistakably peculiar will, realises it technocratically and enforces it in the form of a planetary politics that enslaves nature. The perpetrator could then be identified as the subject of a Western culture of will and understanding and traced back to every single citizen of modernity, provided that each of us is made up of an objective complicity with this imperialist, nature-consuming ego. All those who participate in modernity would thus be members of its primordial horde that is bound together by the collective crime of matricide. Now let us assume for a moment that it could act the way that this speculation presumes. Don't we have to break off the investigation and follow the modern culprit self into the fate of its self-becoming? What has awakened the will to dominate nature in this culprit? Who or what gave the culprit the weapons to do their deed? What history could in the end turn this dominant subject into a master of nuclear fire as well? How was the will for domination positioned within it? And what instances of takeover provided access to exactly this desire and this ability? Is a compulsion to desire perhaps prior to this will to power? Is a certain formation of a self by its very nature as disastrous as a nuclear reactor explosion? Does the self that has attained the power to destroy nature not also happen to itself, like an anonymous disaster? And is this why the potent agency and ability of modernity relates to itself as suffering and powerlessness? These questions are being asked to show that even disasters that have been committed can ultimately never fit into the context of deed and doer. In them, the boundary that separates the logic of responsible action from the logic of the tragic act is crossed. In the tragic deed, not only is the offence the product of the perpetrator, but the perpetrator themselves is the result of what happened. The dramatic, tragic consciousness crystallises only at the event itself, and no learning process follows because the tragic deed makes it clear that the disaster and its perpetrator are made of the same substance. Thus, Chernobyl could belong to the tragedy of ability and desire, where the doers and their disaster emerge from the same happening, from the history of cognitive mobilization of the subject and the planet. The fourth remark pertains to the relationship between truth and disaster itself. If disaster didactics sheds a light on the agony of the Enlightenment, then an agony of truth is simultaneously at play. In fact, the idea that disaster reveals something is only so suggestive to us because we have always associated revelation, in Greek apocalypse, with truth. Truth, insofar as it appears, has ever been presented as a coming to light or being evident. Well, in this respect, every kind of enlightenment contains a drama of light or illumination. Without this photological element, we would not know what knowledge means at all, and why it is always the bright side of things that faces in the direction of knowledge. If for us the possibility of a realization of truth is tied to the coming to light of previously dark things, then the younger enlightenment, as light-emitting process, has also made extensive investments in this lighting model of truth. But we are witnessing the death throes of truth. The old alliance between light and truth, the photological pact of Occidental rationality, has been torn ever since we have been able to use what gives light to bring death. Nuclear weapons also make philosophical history. From a photological point of view, truth takes place as an event of exposure on a 3-step scale. It increases from a natural or artificial lighting of dense bodies that becomes visible through their self-sufficient reflection to an active and invasive fluoroscopy of the bodies until the bodies are finally transformed entirely into light. The photological enlightenment encompasses all and any objects from the point of view of their luminosity, transparency, transformability into light. If enlightenment has a dramatic finality in itself, it is located in the eradication of the initial differences between light and matter, as it appears in ordinary lighting via a terminal transformation of all matter into light. As long as enlightenment operated in the middle analytical stage of an X-ray logic, it could not foresee the end of its movement towards light. The light kinetic dimension of the process only became transparent in the moment that modern nuclear physics actually reached the level of a radical thinning of matter. The cutting-edge technologies under the rule of light are a consequence of the photological process in that they turn matter directly into light, brighter than 1,000 suns. But what can we still see in this light? Is the light of a nuclear explosion one in which the world would learn something about its situation? Or does not this light itself turn into the last reality, into the disappearance of everything in a light storm? Instead of shedding light on the state of things, the thinning light eliminates them together with those who want to understand them. Something of these paradoxes takes effect in the speculations of disaster didactics as well. Those who count on learning from disaster expect the explosion to illuminate dark minds. The warning disaster is itself supposed to be the disaster warning. The actually occurring transformation into light is supposed to critically examine our civilizational process. Those who follow this logic to its conclusion will arrive at a fatal conclusion. Only an apocalypse could act as a convincing warning against an apocalypse. Only an actual disaster could provide evidence for a truth that must occur, both apocalyptically and in the present, in order to become completely true. Thus, the disaster that makes sense to all is a disaster no one survives. When all the possibilities to transform disaster into pedagogy are played out and have been understood in the context of their necessary failure, then all the pathways for the history-making reflex of fleeing forward will be blocked. The powers that produce the catastrophe, and at the same time want to be saved from it, suddenly pile up on top of themselves. It is not, save yourself if you can, but recognize the situation. That becomes the slogan of the age. And thus the situation emerges where panicked consciousness could develop into culture. Everything before that point remains the bourgeoisie with rocket ships. It is only through the experience of panic that one is freed from didactic illusions. It is the bridge to a consciousness that no longer hopes to gain something from disaster, certainly no civilization-critical revelations. Panicked culture begins where mobilization in the form of a permanent flight forward ends. For this reason, the history of a panicked culture would play the role of the chronic end of history itself. The kinetic motives that have heretofore made history would be tamed in it by way of an explicit culture whose effort would be to prevent the invasion of new history-making impulses from precisely the post-historic knowledge of the catastrophe of historical mobilization. This, a previously esoteric form of consciousness, referred to as enlightenment within spiritual jargon, would become a public matter. In a panicked, ecstatic culture, entire populations would perform an act that was previously only done by a scattered few. The leap of consciousness through time to the end times, and the subject's exit from the causality of flight and hope. Thereby, the post-historical culture of panic would be the only alternative to the culture of historical mobilization, which already has no more history left ahead of it. Just a countdown